This story is based on true events. My name is Daniel, and what I am about to recount is a series of events that forever changed my life, leaving me with a deep, lingering fear of the unknown. This is the true story of Blackwood Manor, a place so haunted and sinister that its memory still sends shivers down my spine. It began when I inherited the old family estate in the remote woods of Maine. Blackwood Manor had been in our family for generations, but it had stood abandoned for nearly 50 years after my great-grandparents mysteriously disappeared. I was intrigued by the stories surrounding the manor, tales of ghosts and unexplained phenomena, but I never believed in such things. I decided to renovate the house and make it my new home, thinking it would be a great adventure. The journey to the manor was eerie from the start. The dense forest seemed to close in around the narrow dirt road, and a thick fog hung in the air, obscuring the landscape. As I approached the manor, its looming silhouette appeared through the mist. The house was an imposing structure, with Gothic architecture and a dark, foreboding aura. Vines had overgrown the walls, and many of the windows were broken or boarded up. Despite its decrepit state, there was something oddly compelling about the manor. I arrived late in the afternoon, and the sun was already setting. The first night, I decided to sleep in the living room on a makeshift bed, as the bedrooms were filled with dust and debris. As I settled in, the house creaked and groaned, the sound amplified by the silence of the surrounding woods. I brushed it off as the house settling, but deep down, I felt a growing unease. That night, I was awakened by a strange noise. It sounded like whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from the walls. I sat up, straining to hear, but the whispers stopped. I chalked it up to my imagination and tried to go back to sleep. But just as I was drifting off, I felt a cold breeze sweep across my face. I opened my eyes and saw a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my makeshift bed. My heart raced, and I fumbled for the flashlight I had brought with me. I shone it towards the figure, but it had vanished. The next morning, I explored the manor more thoroughly. Each room seemed to have its own story, its own aura of sorrow and fear. The walls were adorned with old, faded portraits of my ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow me as I moved through the halls. I found a grand library filled with dusty tomes and journals. One journal, in particular, caught my eye. It belonged to my great-grandmother, Eliza. As I read through it, I discovered detailed accounts of strange occurrences and paranormal experiences she had witnessed in the manor. Eliza wrote about hearing footsteps in the attic when no one was there, seeing ghostly apparitions in the garden, and feeling an oppressive presence in certain rooms. She mentioned a particularly disturbing event where she saw a shadowy figure standing at the edge of her bed, just as I had experienced. The journal ended abruptly, with a final entry hinting at some dark secret hidden within the walls of the manor. Intrigued and unnerved, I decided to continue my renovation work, hoping to uncover more about the manor's history. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Doors would slam shut on their own, objects would move inexplicably, and I often felt like I was being watched. One night, as I was working late in the library, I heard a loud thud coming from the basement. I had not yet ventured down there, as it was in a state of disrepair and filled with old, forgotten belongings. With trepidation, I made my way to the basement. The stairs creaked under my weight, and the air grew colder as I descended. The basement was dimly lit, and the shadows seemed to dance along the walls. As I reached the bottom, I saw a large, old trunk in the corner. It was covered in dust and cobwebs, but it seemed out of place, as if it had been recently disturbed. I approached the trunk and, with some effort, pried it open. Inside, I found a collection of old photographs, letters, and artifacts. But what caught my attention was a small, leather-bound book. It was a diary, much like my great-grandmother's, but this one belonged to my great-grandfather, Thomas. His entries were filled with accounts of his own experiences, which were even more disturbing than Eliza's. Thomas wrote about hearing voices calling his name, feeling unseen hands touching him, and seeing dark, malevolent figures in the mirrors. He described how the manor seemed to come alive at night, with the walls whispering secrets and the shadows taking on a life of their own. The final entries in his diary spoke of a ritual that he and Eliza had performed in a desperate attempt to cleanse the house of its malevolent spirits. But something had gone terribly wrong, and they had unleashed a force far more powerful and sinister than they could have imagined. As I read these entries, a sense of dread washed over me. I realized that whatever my great-grandparents had unleashed was still present in the manor, and it was growing stronger. The events of the following nights confirmed my worst fears. I began experiencing vivid nightmares, filled with images of blood, death, and despair. I would wake up in a cold sweat, with a feeling of being suffocated by an unseen force. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of a woman screaming. I rushed to the source of the sound, but there was no one there. The screams echoed through the halls, growing louder and more desperate. I followed the sound to the basement, where I found the trunk I had previously opened. It was now empty, except for a single blood-stained letter. The letter was from Eliza to Thomas, written in a frantic, almost illegible script. She begged him to stop the ritual, to leave the manor and never return. But it was too late. The ritual had already been completed, and they were trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. The manor was not just haunted. It was a gateway to something far darker and more malevolent. I knew I had to leave, but the manor had other plans. That night, as I packed my belongings, the house came alive with a fury I had never experienced before. The walls shook, objects flew across the room, and a deafening roar filled the air. I felt a cold, clammy hand grasp my shoulder, and I was thrown across the room with a force that left me breathless. I stumbled to my feet and ran towards the front door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. The shadows in the house seemed to converge, forming a dark, menacing figure that blocked my path. I could feel its eyes boring into me, filled with a hatred that chilled me to the bone. I was trapped, and there was no escape. Desperation took hold as I searched for any possible way out. The dark figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. I remembered the basement and the ritual my great-grandparents had performed. Perhaps there was a way to reverse it, to banish the malevolent force that held the manor in its grip. With no other options, I made my way back to the basement. The air grew colder with each step, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on my shoulders. The trunk was still open, the blood-stained letter lying ominously inside. I picked it up, hoping to find some clue that could help me. As I read through Eliza's frantic words once more, I noticed a mention of a specific book hidden in the library, a grimoire that contained the ritual and its counter-ritual. I raced to the library, my heart pounding. The shadows seemed to follow me, whispering threats and taunts. I frantically searched through the shelves, knocking over books and papers in my haste. Finally, I found it, a thick, leather-bound tome with strange symbols on the cover. As I opened it, the pages seemed to come alive, filled with dark incantations and rituals. I found the ritual my great-grandparents had performed, along with detailed instructions for reversing it. The counter-ritual required a series of precise steps and ingredients that were scattered throughout the house. With a sense of urgency, I began gathering what I needed: candles, herbs, and various artifacts that had been stored in the basement. As I worked, the house seemed to fight back. The walls vibrated with a low, ominous hum, and the shadows grew darker and more aggressive. I felt their icy touch as I moved through the rooms, but I pushed on, driven by a desperate need to escape. Finally, with everything prepared, I returned to the basement to perform the counter-ritual. The basement was now a nexus of dark energy. The air was thick with malevolence, and the shadows seemed to pulse with life. I set up the candles and arranged the artifacts according to the instructions in the grimoire. As I began to chant the incantations, the house responded with fury. The walls shook, and a deafening roar filled the air. The dark figure appeared again, its form more defined and menacing. It lunged at me, but I held my ground, continuing the chant with all my might. The ritual seemed to last an eternity. The figure thrashed and writhed, its form shifting and contorting as if in pain. The shadows around me grew thicker, pressing in from all sides. I could feel my strength waning, but I knew I had to complete the ritual. With one final, desperate effort, I shouted the last incantation. There was a blinding flash of light, and a wave of energy surged through the basement. The dark figure let out a piercing scream, then dissolved into the shadows. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the house fell silent. I collapsed to the floor, exhausted but relieved. The next morning, I left Blackwood Manor. I couldn't bear to stay another moment in that cursed place. As I drove away, I looked back one last time. The manor stood silent and still, its dark presence seemingly gone. But I knew better. Some things can never be truly banished, and the memory of what I had experienced would haunt me forever. Years later, I still have nightmares about Blackwood Manor. The shadows, the whispers, and the malevolent presence that had tormented me remain etched in my mind. I've tried to move on, but the fear never really goes away. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the whispers, faint and indistinct, calling me back to the manor. But I know I can never return. The darkness that lurks within Blackwood Manor is something far beyond human understanding, a malevolence that will never be fully vanquished. And so, I live with the memory, a constant reminder of the horrors that lie just beyond the veil of our reality. Blackwood Manor may be silent now, but its darkness will never truly fade. It waits, patient and eternal, for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble into its grasp. And when that day comes, the horrors of Blackwood Manor will once again be unleashed. This story is based on true events. My name is Laura, and I used to be a skeptic. I laughed off ghost stories and dismissed tales of the supernatural as mere figments of overactive imaginations. But that was before I spent a summer working at the St. Augustine Lighthouse in Florida, a place with a dark history that would shatter my disbelief and haunt me for the rest of my life. I was a college student looking for an adventurous summer job, and the position of a tour guide at the historic lighthouse seemed perfect. The lighthouse, built in the 19th century, was a popular tourist attraction known for its panoramic views and rich history. However, it was also infamous for its ghost stories, particularly the tragic tale of the three Pity sisters who drowned there in the late 1800s. The first few weeks on the job were uneventful. I led groups of tourists up the narrow, winding stairs to the top of the lighthouse, reciting well-rehearsed facts about its construction and the lives of the keepers who once lived there. Occasionally, a visitor would ask about the ghost stories, and I would recount them with a playful tone, not taking them seriously. But as summer wore on, strange things began to happen. It started with small incidents, lights flickering, cold drafts in the middle of the hot summer, and the feeling of being watched. One evening, as I was locking up, I heard the unmistakable sound of children's laughter echoing from the top of the lighthouse. I brushed it off as a prank or my mind playing tricks on me. A few nights later, I was closing up again when I heard the laughter once more. This time, it was followed by the sound of running footsteps. Determined to catch the pranksters, I grabbed a flashlight and raced up the stairs. As I reached the top, the laughter abruptly stopped, and I found myself alone in the lantern room. My heart pounded in my chest as I shone the flashlight around, but there was no one there. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to one of the senior guides, Tom, who had been working at the lighthouse for over a decade. He gave me a knowing look and told me that many staff members had experienced similar things over the years. He spoke of the Pity Sisters, Eliza, Mary, and Carrie, who had drowned when the cart they were playing in broke loose and plunged into the ocean. Their spirits were said to haunt the lighthouse, their laughter and footsteps a common occurrence. Skeptical but intrigued, I decided to do some research. I spent hours poring over old newspapers and records, piecing together the tragic history of the lighthouse. The more I learned, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the Pity Sisters who had met untimely deaths there. Several lighthouse keepers had also died under mysterious circumstances, including one who fell from the tower and another who was found dead at the bottom of the stairs. One evening, I stayed late to continue my research. The lighthouse was quiet, and I was alone in the small office near the base of the tower. As I read through an old journal, I felt a sudden chill. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath in the air. The lights flickered, and the door to the office creaked open. I turned to see a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's clothes, his eyes empty and hollow. Paralyzed with fear, I watched as the figure slowly moved towards me. He raised a bony finger and pointed towards the stairs. A voice, cold and distant, echoed in my mind. "Go to the top. They are waiting." The figure then vanished, leaving me alone in the freezing room. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my flashlight and made my way up the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, and the air grew colder the higher I climbed. When I reached the lantern room, I found it filled with an eerie, unnatural light. The three Pity Sisters stood there, their ghostly forms flickering like candle flames. They looked at me with sad, empty eyes, and I felt a wave of sorrow wash over me. Suddenly, the room was filled with the sound of crashing waves and the screams of drowning children. I was overwhelmed by a sense of helplessness and despair, as if I were experiencing their final moments. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The girls vanished, and I was left alone in the darkness. I fled down the stairs and out of the lighthouse, my mind reeling from what I had just witnessed. Over the next few days, I tried to make sense of it all, but the memories haunted me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the spirits were trying to tell me something, to warn me of a danger I didn't understand. Determined to get to the bottom of it, I decided to spend a night in the lighthouse. I brought a sleeping bag, some food, and a camera to document anything unusual. As the sun set, I settled in near the base of the tower, my nerves on edge. The hours passed slowly, and the lighthouse creaked and groaned in the wind. At midnight, I heard the laughter again, this time accompanied by whispers and faint music. I followed the sounds up the stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I reached the top, the lantern room was bathed in a ghostly glow. The three sisters were there, along with the shadowy figure of the lighthouse keeper. They were gathered around a large, ornate mirror that I had never seen before. The keeper turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "The mirror is the key," he said in a voice that echoed in my mind. "It holds the souls of the lost." The figures then faded away, leaving me alone with the mirror. I approached it cautiously, feeling a strange pull. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and as I looked into it, I saw scenes from the past. The Pity Sisters playing in the cart, the keeper falling from the tower, and other tragic events that had taken place at the lighthouse. I realized that the mirror was a portal, a window into the past, and that it had somehow trapped the spirits of those who had died there. As I reached out to touch the mirror, I felt a cold hand grip my wrist. I turned to see the shadowy figure of the keeper standing beside me. "You must help us," he pleaded. "Release us from this torment." He then placed a small, old-fashioned key in my hand before vanishing once more. Holding the key, I felt a sense of determination. I had to free the trapped souls and put an end to the hauntings. I examined the mirror and noticed a small keyhole at the bottom of the ornate frame. With trembling hands, I inserted the key and turned it. The mirror's surface began to shimmer and ripple more violently, and a blinding light filled the room. When the light faded, I found myself standing in the lighthouse as it had been over a century ago. The air was filled with the sounds of the ocean, and the distant laughter of children echoed through the halls. I realized that I had been transported back in time, to the day of the Pitti sisters' tragic accident. I hurried down the stairs, my heart pounding. I had to find the girls and prevent the accident. As I reached the base of the tower, I saw them playing near the cart, oblivious to the danger. I shouted a warning, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the wind. Desperate, I ran towards them, but it was too late. The cart broke free and plunged into the ocean, taking the sisters with it. I stood there, helpless and devastated, as the scene faded away. I was back in the present, in the lantern room, with the mirror still shimmering before me. I realized that I couldn't change the past, but perhaps I could still help the spirits find peace. I spent the next few days researching the history of the mirror and consulting with experts in the paranormal. I learned that it was a powerful artifact, capable of trapping souls and creating portals to the past. To free the spirits, I would need to perform a ritual to break its hold on them. With the help of Tom and a few trusted colleagues, I gathered the necessary ingredients for the ritual: candles, herbs, and sacred symbols. We returned to the lighthouse one evening, ready to confront whatever dark forces were at play. We set up the candles and arranged the symbols around the mirror, following the instructions from an ancient text I had found. As we began the ritual, the lighthouse came alive with an otherworldly energy. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to writhe and dance around us. We chanted the incantations, our voices merging with the howling wind. The mirror's surface rippled and shimmered, and the ghostly figures of the Pitti sisters and the lighthouse keeper appeared once more. They watched us with a mixture of hope and fear, their forms flickering like flames. As we continued the ritual, the energy in the room reached a fever pitch. The mirror glowed brighter and brighter, and a deafening roar filled the air. I could feel the dark presence of the mirror fighting back, trying to maintain its hold on the spirits. With one final, desperate effort, we completed the ritual. The mirror shattered with a blinding flash of light, and the ghostly figures let out a collective sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the lighthouse fell silent. The spirits were free. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences at the lighthouse ceased. The cold drafts, the laughter, and the footsteps were gone. The place felt lighter, almost peaceful. I knew that the spirits had finally found the rest they deserved. But the experience left a lasting mark on me. I had seen things that defied explanation, and I knew that there were forces in this world beyond our understanding. I continued to work at the lighthouse, sharing its history with visitors, but I never spoke of the supernatural events I had witnessed. Some things are best left unsaid. To this day, I still feel a connection to the lighthouse and the spirits who once haunted it. I visit the site often, leaving flowers at the base of the tower in memory of the Pitti sisters and the keeper who had sought my help. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the faint echo of children's laughter carried on the wind. This story is based on true events. My name is Daniel, and this is the story of how I came face to face with pure, unadulterated evil. It's a story that I've tried to forget, but the events of that fateful summer still haunt me, clawing their way into my thoughts every night. I've decided to share my experience, hoping it might serve as a warning to others. In the summer of 2002, I was a 22-year-old college student studying psychology. Seeking a unique experience to bolster my resume, I accepted an internship at Ravenwood Asylum, an abandoned psychiatric hospital rumored to be one of the most haunted places in the country. The facility had been shut down in the early 1980s after reports of patient abuse, neglect, and mysterious deaths surfaced, but its dark history stretched back even further. The asylum, located in a remote, forested area, was a massive, decaying structure. Its windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti and ivy. Despite its dilapidated state, it had an eerie beauty that drew me in. I was assigned to work with Dr. William Harrington, a renowned parapsychologist who was conducting research on paranormal activity. From the moment I set foot inside Ravenwood, I felt a heavy, oppressive atmosphere. The air was thick with the scent of mold and decay, and every creak and groan of the old building seemed to echo with the whispers of the past. Dr. Harrington and I set up our equipment in the main hall, which had once been the hub of activity for the hospital staff and patients. During the day, we explored the asylum, documenting its history and setting up cameras and audio recorders in the areas with the most reported activity. The place was a maze of long, dark corridors, crumbling staircases, and empty rooms that seemed to stretch on forever. The asylum's history was etched into its walls. Old patient records, broken medical equipment, and personal belongings left behind in haste. As night fell, the true nature of Ravenwood began to reveal itself. The temperature dropped significantly, and a thick fog rolled in from the surrounding forest, enveloping the building in a ghostly shroud. We started our investigation in the basement, where the asylum's most violent and unstable patients had been kept in isolation. The basement was a labyrinth of small, windowless cells with heavy iron doors. The air was damp and cold, and the silence was oppressive. As we walked through the narrow corridor, our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Dr. Harrington explained that the basement was notorious for its high level of paranormal activity, with numerous reports of disembodied voices, apparitions, and unexplained cold spots. We set up our equipment in one of the larger rooms, which had once been used for electroconvulsive therapy. The room still contained the rusty remains of the old machines, their electrodes dangling like the tentacles of some monstrous creature. As we began our session, asking questions into the darkness, a feeling of dread washed over me. I could sense that we were not alone. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and I saw my breath condense in the air. The EMF detector in my hand started to spike, and the sound of faint whispering filled the room. Dr. Harrington and I exchanged uneasy glances, and he gestured for me to remain silent. We listened intently as the whispers grew louder, forming distinct words and phrases. "Help us," "Trapped," "Never leave." The voices were a cacophony of anguish and despair, pleading for release. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow move. It was fleeting, barely more than a blur, but it was enough to make me jump. Dr. Harrington calmly pointed his flashlight towards the corner of the room, revealing nothing but darkness. We decided to continue our investigation in the upper floors, hoping to capture more evidence of the paranormal. As we ascended the staircase, the oppressive feeling intensified. The walls seemed to close in around us, and the shadows grew darker and more menacing. We reached the second floor, where the asylum's general population had been housed. The rooms here were larger, but they still bore the scars of neglect and decay. We set up our equipment in one of the patient rooms, which had once belonged to a woman named Margaret. According to the records we had found, Margaret had been admitted to Ravenwood in the 1950s for severe depression and anxiety. She had been subjected to numerous experimental treatments, none of which had been successful. She eventually took her own life by hanging herself from the light fixture in her room. As we began our session, I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and hopelessness. I could almost hear Margaret's cries for help, echoing through the years. The room grew colder, and the EMF detector started to spike again. I asked questions into the darkness, hoping to make contact with Margaret's spirit. "Margaret, are you here with us? Can you tell us what happened to you?" There was a long silence, and then the temperature dropped even further. I saw my breath condense in the air once more, and the flashlight in my hand flickered. Suddenly, a voice whispered in my ear, so close that I could feel the cold breath on my skin. "They hurt me. They hurt us all." I jumped back, my heart pounding. Dr. Harrington's eyes widened, and he quickly turned his flashlight towards the source of the voice. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered hospital gown, her eyes hollow and filled with pain. She reached out towards us, her fingers twisted and skeletal. Before we could react, the figure vanished, leaving behind a cold, empty silence. Dr. Harrington and I were both shaken, but we knew we had to continue. We moved on to the next room, where we experienced similar encounters. The spirits of Ravenwood were desperate to communicate, to tell their stories, but their messages were fragmented and filled with sorrow and anger. As the night wore on, the activity grew more intense. We heard footsteps echoing down the hallways, doors slamming shut, and disembodied voices calling out to us. The asylum seemed to come alive, its dark history replaying itself in a never-ending loop of torment. In one of the rooms, we found an old journal belonging to a nurse named Evelyn. Her entries detailed the horrific conditions at Ravenwood, the overcrowded wards, the abusive staff, and the inhumane treatments. She wrote about the patients suffering and how she had tried to help them, but her efforts were in vain. Evelyn's final entry spoke of her decision to end her life, unable to bear the weight of the asylum's darkness any longer. As I read her words, I felt a profound sadness wash over me. These were real people, with real stories of pain and suffering, trapped in a place that had become a prison for their souls. I knew that we had to find a way to help them, to give them the peace they deserved. Determined to uncover the full extent of Ravenwood's dark past, Dr. Harrington and I continued our investigation. We decided to explore the attic, a place that had been off-limits to staff and patients alike. According to the asylum's blueprints, the attic housed storage for old records and equipment, but there were also rumors of secret experiments conducted there. The staircase to the attic was narrow and steep, the wooden steps creaking under our weight. As we reached the top, we were met with a thick layer of dust and the stench of decay. The attic was filled with old furniture, broken medical equipment, and stacks of patient records. The air was heavy with the scent of mold and rot, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to intensify. We began sifting through the records, uncovering more evidence of the asylum's dark history. There were detailed accounts of experimental treatments, many of which bordered on torture. Patients had been subjected to electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other brutal procedures in the name of science. The records also revealed that several patients had died under mysterious circumstances, their deaths covered up by the staff. As we delved deeper into the attic, we discovered a hidden door at the back of the room. It was padlocked, but Dr. Harrington managed to pry it open with a crowbar. Behind the door was a small, windowless room. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, each containing strange, preserved specimens. In the center of the room was a large, metal table, stained with rust and what looked like dried blood. The room had a sinister feel to it, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was clear that this was where the most horrific experiments had taken place. As we examined the jars, we found labeled specimens of organs and other body parts, evidence of the gruesome procedures that had been performed on the patients. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and we heard a low, guttural growl emanating from the shadows. The temperature dropped rapidly, and our breath became visible in the air. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and the shadows in the room seemed to writhe and shift. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. It was a man, his face twisted in a grotesque expression of rage and pain. He was dressed in tattered hospital clothes, his skin pale and covered in scars. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and he raised a bony finger, pointing directly at us. "You shouldn't be here," he hissed, his voice echoing in the small room. "Leave, before it's too late." Before we could react, the figure lunged at us, his hands reaching out with a desperate fury. We stumbled back, the equipment clattering to the floor. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us both shaken and breathless. Dr. Harrington and I knew we had to leave the attic, but we couldn't abandon our investigation. We quickly gathered our equipment and made our way back down the staircase. As we descended, we heard footsteps following us, heavy and deliberate. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I could sense the malevolent presence lurking in the shadows. We returned to the main hall, where we decided to take a break and regroup. The experiences in the attic had left us both rattled, and we needed to process what we had encountered. As we reviewed the footage and audio recordings, we found clear evidence of the paranormal activity. EVP recordings of voices, unexplained temperature drops, and shadowy figures captured on camera. One of the recordings stood out. It was an EVP captured in the attic, where we had heard the growl. The voice was deep and menacing, and it spoke a single word: suffer. The word sent a shiver down my spine, and I knew that whatever was haunting Ravenwood was not just a restless spirit, but something far more sinister. Determined to uncover the truth, we decided to spend one final night in the asylum. We set up our equipment in the main hall, hoping to capture more evidence of the paranormal activity. As night fell, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The temperature dropped, and the fog rolled in once again, enveloping the building in an eerie shroud. We began our investigation, moving from room to room, documenting the strange occurrences. The spirits seemed to grow bolder, their presence more tangible. We heard whispers, footsteps, and the sound of doors slamming shut. The EMF detectors spiked, and the temperature fluctuations became more intense. In one of the patient rooms, we encountered a particularly malevolent spirit. The room had once belonged to a man named Thomas, who had been admitted to Ravenwood for schizophrenia. According to the records, Thomas had been subjected to numerous brutal treatments, and he had eventually died under mysterious circumstances. As we entered Thomas's room, the air grew thick with a sense of anger and hatred. The EMF detector spiked, and the temperature dropped sharply. We began asking questions, hoping to make contact with Thomas's spirit. "Thomas, are you here with us? Can you tell us what happened to you?" There was a long silence, and then the room was filled with a loud, guttural growl. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to come alive. Suddenly, the bed in the center of the room began to shake violently, as if an unseen force was trying to tear it apart. Dr. Harrington and I stood frozen, our hearts pounding. The growling grew louder, more menacing, and we could feel a powerful, malevolent presence in the room. The temperature dropped even further, and I felt a cold hand grip my shoulder. I turned, but there was no one there. The growling intensified, and the bed shook with such force that it threatened to collapse. The lights flickered again, and I saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was Thomas, his face twisted in a mask of rage and pain. He raised his hand, pointing directly at us, and I felt a surge of cold, malevolent energy. "You did this to me," he hissed, his voice filled with anger and sorrow. "You will suffer as I did." Before we could react, the figure lunged at us, and the room was filled with a deafening roar. The bed collapsed, and the lights went out, plunging us into darkness. We fumbled for our flashlights, our hearts racing with fear. When we finally managed to get the lights back on, the room was empty, but the oppressive feeling remained. We knew that we had to leave, but we were determined to finish our investigation. We moved on to the next room, hoping to capture more evidence. As the night wore on, the activity grew even more intense. We heard voices calling out to us, footsteps echoing down the hallways, and the sound of doors slamming shut. The spirits of Ravenwood were desperate to communicate, their anguish and anger palpable. In the final room we investigated, we encountered the spirit of Evelyn, the nurse who had taken her own life. Her presence was more peaceful than the others, but her sorrow was overwhelming. As we asked questions, hoping to make contact, the room grew colder, and I felt a sense of deep sadness. "Evelyn, can you tell us what happened here?" There was a long silence, and then a soft, sorrowful voice filled the room. "They hurt us. They hurt us all." The temperature dropped further, and I saw my breath condense in the air. Evelyn's spirit appeared before us, her face filled with sorrow and pain. She reached out towards us, her fingers twisted and skeletal. "Help us, please." Her voice was a plea for help, and I felt a deep sense of empathy and sorrow. The spirits of Ravenwood were trapped, their suffering and anguish echoing through the years. We knew that we had to find a way to help them, to give them the peace they deserved. As dawn approached, the activity began to subside. The spirits seemed to retreat, their presence fading into the shadows. Dr. Harrington and I packed up our equipment, our hearts heavy with the weight of what we had experienced. We left Ravenwood Asylum, but the memories of that night stayed with us. The spirits we had encountered, their stories of pain and suffering, haunted our thoughts. We knew that the asylum's dark history would never truly be erased, but we hoped that by sharing our experiences, we could help bring some measure of peace to the restless souls trapped within its walls. To this day, I can still hear their whispers in the dead of night, their pleas for help echoing in my mind. Ravenwood Asylum remains a place of darkness and sorrow, its haunted halls a testament to the suffering of those who were once imprisoned within its walls. And as long as their stories are remembered, their spirits will never truly be at rest.